We'll start in just a minute, but I'm really glad that all of you have seated yourselves in the way that you have. No, I'm serious here. This is the state of the global identity infrastructure, which is we have people that are connected. We're all here in the same room, breathing the same oxygen, but we're distanced from each other. We'll come back to that in a graphic that Nick Mothershaw, who's going to start us, will talk more about. That's right. Thank you for social distancing.
So I will talk to you about GAIN, the Global Assured Identity Network. But before we do, we wanted to ask you to start thinking about the kind of person or organisation you are. So when you see an idea and a challenge to be solved, what do? An intractable problem, like identity interoperability. How do you approach it? Do you do the moonshot? Do you run with it, run at it, sort of problem? Do you think, yeah, that's a good idea, I'll sit and wait and see, maybe take a wash and brief, or do you put your head in the sand, ignore it, someone else will sort that later, however it affects me. The reason I ask this is because at the end, we're going to ask the show of hands. And when we've spoken to you about this concept of GAIN, we want to know where you sit and which of these kind of three mindsets we've left you in. And if you're in the first, we want to talk to you more because we're trying to move this initiative forward. So Donna, if you want to talk to us about what GAIN is and where it came from.
Yeah, this is what I was talking about in terms of what occurred to me as I looked in this room, is that we have, on a global basis, the history of the internet that informs us. Many of you in the identity community will say, rightly so, that the internet was built without an identity layer. And as a result, as it scaled, as it extended, we lost what was initially a unspoken and assumed part of the internet, which is that we trust each other. And in the absence of that trust, all kinds of bad things have happened. One of the things that's happened is the amount of internet-based crime has skyrocketed, even more so during COVID. So we've lost the ability to control the trust fabric, if you will, and we are left with the predominant models of the internet, which is surveillance. We're tracking you to sell you a new pair of shoes. We're tracking you to protect you from the bad guys, et cetera. So this is the state of play that we're in today. And so what we'd like to do is to share with you a vision that started just about a year ago and started from the ground up. And this notion of interoperability and a globally assured identity network began to take shape. A number of people, perhaps most notably Kim Cameron, Daniel Goldschneider, and another colleague from Swift began to talk about, wouldn't it be, is it possible if we created a network of networks, and if we tried to come up with interoperability between and among very disparate networks that come from very different economic, technical, and cultural areas. So this notion of interoperability is really the mainstay of our talk today. So a curious thing happened. A private conversation went viral, and in September of last year at the European Identity Conference, over 150 authors of a white paper called The GAIN were able to publish something that was notable in a couple of different ways. The paper was what I call no logos, pro bono, and open, which is, it was a collaboration among people that weren't getting paid, but shared this common vision of a technology agnostic, open, internet scale, interoperability network of networks. And that's what we'd like to talk about today.
Thanks, Don. So that was the vision, and that was the vision we shared 9 months ago now. And the next question was, okay, this is a great vision. We've got 154 people behind it, and as soon as we present it, we have 154 more, because it's a difficult vision to disagree with, because it helps global interoperability, it helps global trade, it helps global citizenship. I think we can all see that that this is an end state that we'd want to get the identity ecosystem to. So we're now starting to explore, how do we get there? Is this technically viable? So we're looking at various technical layers and connections, and how do we make connections across different frameworks? Is governance viable? And how are we going to look at frameworks that are governed in different legal jurisdictions through different methodologies and enable them to interoperate? And a lot of this is about improving goodwill to make this happen. And it feels now that we're at the time where we've got maturing trust frameworks in many countries. We've got people starting to create them in others to tackle the interoperability now. If we leave it too late, we are going to be left with a very difficult problem to solve. So we started off with some listening sessions, kind of over the autumn, so after the launch, going around to the Thibeau plenary. We had a workshop alongside the OAX conference. OIDF held some virtual workshops as well. We started looking at standards. Now, one of the key points of this is no new standards. There are standards there. We're looking, how do you leverage existing standards to make these connections and make it work? So what's the connective tissue to technically bring this together? Making sure it's technology agnostic, we can support OpenID and verifiable credentials. Since we wrote this presentation, that world has moved on hugely, as you're seeing at this conference. But also other MDL type technical ecosystems, and also legal entities. So who are the actors in the ecosystem? Are they relying parties? Are they issuers? Are they identity providers of some form? Who are they, and what are they entitled or permitted to do by their frameworks? So we start to explore that. We're looking at proof of concept. So OIDF, there's a proof of concept, which we'll tell you a little bit more at the moment. And Alpha POC has already been run in the community group form to look at that. And as OAX, we're running an interoperability working group looking at a global interoperability framework. So we already defined trust frameworks. How do we make them interoperate? And we wanted to bring a set of non-profits together and aligned around this vision. So we've managed to start to do that with 5 initial not-profits who've come together to make this all work and connect. So GAIN is not a new organisation. It's a movement, it's a vision. And its custodians at the moment are these 5 not-for-profits who are all playing different roles in it. So Open Identity Exchange, we're looking at the governance, trust framework layers and how they might interoperate. OpenID Foundation are looking at the identity standards and technical connections through the GAIN Community Working Group. Glyph are looking at who the legal entities are involved and what roles they can play. Cloud Signature Consortium, where a digital identity will link into an electronic signature, we want to make sure that works easily and cost-effectively through cloud-based signatures. So they bring that aspect. And the International Institute of Finance bring relying party members from the banks and also identity providers from banks, because in many jurisdictions, the bank is the identity provider. Not as many as governments. Most digital identities come from governments, but banks play a significant role in this. But this isn't all about finance. It's about interoperability across finance-based and government-based internet ID ecosystems. And we want more people to join and take their part in assembling this jigsaw that will make global interoperability work and make it effective. So Don.
one of the key things about this movement is that it's standards-based. As Nick said, that the hypothesis is that there are sufficient standards extant today so that this kind of network could be built. The 5 organizations that Nick referred to were, of course, essential to that proposition. Standards organizations want you to collaborate so that we can build standards. I think you should ask standards organizations to collaborate so that we can build this kind of a network. But those 5 organizations are only the beginning. We anticipate and certainly look forward to the collaboration with Trust over IP, with our colleagues in India, who have built a remarkable trust framework and interoperable system for over 1 billion people. So we're trying to rally both organizations without starting a new organization. We're trying to test the compatibility of standards without building a new standard. So these are what we call the connective tissue, if you will. But it's rules and tools that are at the heart of a network, technical tools and governance rules. The best way to stop a working group from working is to go, what about liability? You'll feel the oxygen flow out of the room. So what we've done, and Nick will describe it a bit more, is that we now are testing the hypothesis of this white paper. Are the existing standards with a technology agnostic approach, whether it's federated or decentralized, are they sufficiently robust, and can we prove out this proposition in a test environment, in a POC? So that's the job of the OpenID Foundation. Along with the OpenID Foundation, GLIFE and other participating standards organizations are launching their own initiatives and white papers. But as Nick said, even since our beginning a year ago, the landscape of the identity ecosystem has changed and is changing rapidly. And you can feel the change here in Denver. And Nick, I think the change comes when we begin to talk about this slide. Because what we think this slide lacks is references to wallets and a more heightened emphasis on verifiable credentials. But what we're doing now, what's happening now, what you're invited to participate in now at the OpenID Foundation is a test of the robustness of standards like OpenID Connect, the financial grade API, the new eKYC and identity assurance standards to see if they are sufficient, along with OAuth and other standards from other organizations, to be the scaffolding for this network of networks, this scheme of schemes, this GAIN thing that we are talking about. So, and just to sum up, so that POC is extant today. If you'd like to learn more, you can contact me, Don, at oidf.org, or you can look at the OpenID Foundation website. All of the deliberations of the POC are available there. So this is where we're at on the tool side. Nick is going to talk to you about what's happening on the rules side. But I'm really pleased that we have these concurrent work groups informing each other's agendas.
Don, thanks. So on the rules side, so those of you familiar with OIX, we publish a guide to trust frameworks. It's got a 30-point guide. It's orange and blue. And from that, we've distilled some key areas that we need to focus on for interoperability. So the first thing is we went over those 30 areas, which ones are going to be vital in understanding an identity from one jurisdiction to another when they're running in different trust frameworks. And this is what we drew out. So we need a set of new principles around this, or we need to have a set of principles against which we can check everybody is operating. Key, and where we're spending most of our time, is the identity trust layer, assurance and proofing, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Data standards. If people are using data in the same way and describing it in the same way and describing evidence in the same way, it's going to make interoperability a lot easier. There are a lot of different data standards out there. No one is making recommendations on which data standards should be used in the context of digital ID. We need to address that, and we'll be making some recommendations on that. Who are the actors in the ecosystem? What roles are they playing? But more importantly, if they're playing the role of an identity provider, what can they do? What proofing methods are they certified to, and to what standards? So we can start to make that transparent and communicate that across the ecosystem. And then the area which is much bigger than its box suggests is all the legal elements, liability, data management, consents. So frameworks and countries tackle these things differently. So how are we going to make things interoperate when we've got fundamental differences in positions on liability? And does that actually matter? Because if it's good enough in the home country for the ID and I'm using it somewhere else, what's the risk of the liability model being different? So there's a number of different ways we can go with this as we unpack what goes on in each of these areas. And it's interesting as we look at them and say, how would we do interoperability in each of the areas? It's coming out differently, but it's all coming out in quite a nice map of codification as to how we can code up trust frameworks. And an important thing we've realized, we've started analyzing trust frameworks. We've analyzed about half a dozen in detail, probably it's 8 now, on what we can see. Frameworks have different levels of transparency in terms of what they publish. So we've got a very patchy picture so far of how frameworks act in certain areas. So we decided we need to talk to the frameworks. So the frameworks are coming to join what we're doing. So we're talking to Canada, UK, Singapore, we were in Bank ID Sweden involved in the project, and trying to bring some key frameworks in so we can start doing a more detailed comparison and validate the vision that we've got here. But there are a mixture of government-led and private sector frameworks that we're bringing in here. Because what I want to happen is when I come here, or anywhere in the world, I have an ID. And if you saw the presentation I gave earlier, we're talking about it being a smart digital ID. So it's not just a collection of credentials like this, it's got smarts in it, it understands rules, it adapts. Importantly, what it does is it adapts to the rules of the trust framework. So when I land here, like my mobile phone, when I turn on my digital ID, it goes, oh, hey, hang on, I'm not in the UK anymore, I'm in the US. Trust framework rules in the US look like this. We've got NIST. We've got IALs rather than LOCs, as we've got in the UK. I understand that because I'm smart, and I can work out which of my credentials are still valid and which aren't. So I've got some of them here grayed out. And things like passports, driving licenses done to standards, they're likely to still be valid if everyone's working to the same standard. Banking stuff from banks works already. You know, we take that for granted. Payment instruments work all over the world pretty much. So you know, lots of these things will work. How can we make more of them work? And levels of assurance, can we work out that a level of confidence medium that I had over here, with the credentials I've got that are still valid, do I now get a NIST IAL2, for instance, or not? And if not, what are the gaps I need to fill? The smart digital ID should work that out. And we are talking a lot about the currency of identity. What is the currency of identity? Is it levels of assurance? Most frameworks have a levels of assurance. It's a common construct to communicate a level of trust. But the way people derive those levels of trust and achieve them is different in every framework. We might have numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in different frameworks, but they don't mean the same thing. They're only meaningful in the context of that framework. Can we, like we do with currencies, paper currencies, digital currencies, come up with a way, with exchange rates for these things, so we now understand the equivalence? Or can we not? And our hypothesis at the moment is that that's going to be difficult. So we need to actually drop down to the underlying credentials that are in the wallet and re-add them up in the new trust framework to see what they score as we go from one framework to another. So this is one of the main areas we're exploring at the moment. If we're going to do that, we need credentials done in a standard way across the globe so that people can understand that they are consistent and then build up their own levels of trust, level of confidence, level of assurance, whatever you call it locally, from that particular piece of that particular credential. So that's just an example of some of the work we're doing in the OX side of the working group at the moment. just to wrap up, who's this for? What are we doing game for? Who are we doing it for? It's ultimately for end users, but to make it happen, we need government trust frameworks. We need private sector trust frameworks. We need banks who are part of ID schemes and their schemes who are taking part of it, and independent ID providers, and then people who are going to want to consume that identity, relying parties from any sector. And if you have, so your little icon for your sector up here, don't we mean any sector. So we want you to come and work with us on achieving this vision. Which leads me to that kind of question that I warned you about at the start. So now you've heard us talk about this concept and this vision and what we're doing about it. It's for all of you. It's for the users, your neighbours, for your children, for people who are in need. And as we look at what's going on around the globe, if we'd got this problem solved already, people's lives who are already in significant distress, who are now refugees, we could have made the digital ID bit just that little bit easier for them. I know that doesn't take away any of the other problems they're having. But yeah, we've got a duty to try and make that digital part of people's lives flow and make it work well. So what do you think? Are you up for this? Are you unsure? Or is this a problem that will sit and wait and someone else can solve it?
I know what they're thinking.
What do you think they're thinking of?
They think this is just interesting, but not relevant. They think this is just a pie-in-the-sky kind of construct that's not really relevant to their careers or their jobs. But I would submit two pieces of evidence, and you're sitting on them. Credit cards are globally interoperable. Smartphones you can use anywhere, yet they have very different regulatory, technical, and other constraints. Yet this global interoperability level, or global interoperability vision, I think is going to become coming soon. And what we'd like you to do is to participate in building this network. Not only are the two pieces of evidence in your wallet, but the new discussion around wallets is another piece of evidence. The new discussion around claims in wallets is another piece. So our thesis is that this is coming like a locomotive, and we'd like you to vote now how you want to participate.
So, I think, having watched me, that I reckon you're going to be in the first category here, because I've seen heads up and I've seen people taking photos of what we're talking about. So I think we've captured your interest here, but let's have a vote. So who's a yes? Who wants to get on board with this? Two hands up at the back there. Brilliant, fantastic. So you're with us on this vision, that's fantastic. Anyone in the maybes? Not so sure? Not sure it's the right time yet?
How do you keep the corporate interests from screwing it up? Look at our government as
We'll come on to questions in a minute. Let me take the final. Is there anyone who just thinks this isn't worth doing? Have we got any? Yeah, one or two people. Yeah, one or two people.
It's not clear on the liability side how this is going to work. Maybe more information on how this will solve the liability problem.
Yeah.
Make it more.
Yeah. Okay, I can answer that question in a minute.
Dude,
okay,
you used the liability thing on us.
So by and large then, I think we've got your support on this. And I think as we evolve and move digital identity forward, that support will grow. We're really pleased with coming along today to find out more. And if you want to get on board with us and be part of this, then talk to me or Don afterwards. OpenID Foundation and Open Identity Exchange have got stands at the far end of the hall, pretty much next to each other. It's very easy to get them confused, isn't it? So do come and see us if you're interested. But yeah, I mean the next thing was questions. So let's pick up. So I pick up the liability one first. So what we're doing on liability is we're starting to look at the frameworks, and what we've realised pretty quickly is there are only a few ways in which they handle liability. Either the issuer of the identity, and this is usually where it's a government, takes no liability whatsoever for issuing an incorrect credential, an incorrect national ID, incorrect passport. And we all live with that situation today. And therefore, the person who gets stung by that is the person who ends up accepting it, the relying party. So that's one situation. The other situation, and this is more prevalent in more commercial systems, is there's some kind of fault-based liability, and this is where the trust framework comes in. So when people are working under the trust framework, the way the liability model is frequently written is, well, the framework's laid out a set of rules. If you're working to the rules, and you can show you're working to the rules, you won't be held liable if you're found to be at fault, if there's a problem with the identity. And then fraud overlays that. So what happens if an identity fraudster gets in and gets an identity? What happens if they circumvent those rules of the framework? And they will, because fraudsters do that. That's what they're all about. They're about bending and breaking the rules to get what they want. So we know that will happen. And then there's two treatments of that. Either there is no liability taken by the identity provider in the event of fraud because they followed the rules, but there is usually then some kind of obligation on all parties, including the framework itself, to upgrade its rules to try and defend against the fraud. So a bit of fraud gets through, but we try and keep on top of it. The other model is the identity provider will take some liability in the event of fraud, and that is usually capped. And there are a couple of instances where it's been unlimited, but it's usually capped. You know, in Norway, it's 10,000 NOK, Norwegian about 1,000 euros. So those are the different states. That's about 4 different states you can end up in as a trust framework. So our hypothesis in that area at the moment is, okay, if we can describe those 4 different states of liability, we can then enable frameworks to declare which one they are. And when I arrive in the US with my framework, and my framework takes no liability, that is understood by the framework. And it is therefore can be understood by the relying parties. Somebody then needs to make a decision. The framework overall may say, well, I'm not accepting IDs from that country at all because the liability isn't right. So it just simply doesn't work. The more likely situation is the liabilities are different, but they're good enough and they're the state of play in the country that has created the trust framework. And it's unlikely the accepting country will now be able to influence or change that. So they're probably just going to have to live with it. But at least they understand it. And if there aren't many IDs being moved around the ecosystem, living with it is an answer. If there are a lot of IDs, putting something in the middle, and we've been toying with this concept of an interoperability agent, which could be a commercial role rather than a technical role, who would sit in the middle and maybe would start taking some of that liability, insuring against it, working out the risk. So that would be one possibility. But this is what we're looking at the moment. We haven't answered the question, but we're working on it. And we're working on what the options are and unbundle it. And that's liability is just one area we're looking at, and we're trying to unbundle all of these different areas. So this is it's a big jigsaw to try and put together. I talked about eating elephants a lot when we were doing this before, but I've met an elephant since, and it was very nice, and I didn't want to eat it, so we moved on to jigsaw. Yeah,
this gentleman had a very pointed question. Sir. Didn't you?
Oh, yeah.
Money influencing government is certainly part of it. How do you keep that from polluting this the same way our government is essentially ignoring a good section of its citizens, if not all of them, who don't have beyond this amount of wealth or whatever? Because this is a rich players-only society at this point.
Let me try and answer your question. I'll strip away some of the political discussion, which I think is valid, but not appropriate to the occasion. Think about the world as it exists today in terms of globally interoperable networks. Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, the Chinese. What is characteristic of each of them is that they are built, they're walled gardens, that they're extremely well-built vertical systems. We're proposing an alternative, one built on open standards, one that allows a great deal of flexibility in terms of its choice of technologies, We want to build a roaming agreement, if you will. Just as in the mobile network operators in each country and each regulators have a set of specific liability and other rules to use, yet somehow they found a way of collaborating and interoperating on a global basis. That's what we're aiming at. And the most recent developments in terms of decentralized identity, in terms of a new way of thinking about wallets, new requirements for wallets coming out of Europe, the notion of verifiable credentials in that wallet, it opens up an opportunity for a third choice or multiple choices built on open standards. That's what we're all about. That's what we're asking you to participate in. Maybe we have to create a new Esperanto language. We'd like you to be both contributors to that and speakers of it, because we think this is important. As Nick says, it's important to people, but in the world that we live in now, couldn't we as a community build bridges between trust frameworks, between different jurisdictions that allow for identity data and other kinds of data to be shared in a secure, privacy-protecting, and easy-to-use way? So that's our ambition, and we need your help to do that, because there isn't a sponsor for GAIN, there isn't a home for GAIN. It is here in this community. So do we have time for other questions? Or
Yeah, I think so. I was just going to add on that one. Separately, OIX is doing a lot of work around inclusivity in digital identity. To some extent, we've got to solve that locally, and then everything will interoperate. But if you want to talk separately on that, we've got a whole working group looking at that.
I think your answer makes a lot of sense. I think there very well might be a way around that. It will be a difficult activity, but I think what else do we have to do?
Well, where there's a will, there's a way, and that's why we wanted you to vote.
I think group one.
Good. Nick?
Yeah, we've got more questions if you want.
I'm trying to avoid Steve. Sir.
Yeah, I think the examples you gave about credit cards and cell phones were really valuable for me, because I can see in hindsight what problem they solve. I mean, cell phones are communication, credit cards are payment. How come I can land an airplane at every airport? Because people agreed on standards for those things, and so that's to move people. But for this, since it's future looking, I don't see as concrete like what problem this solves. Like, I get that, yeah, it's nice if your digital identity is portable in an abstract sense, but like, what exact problems does that solve? That would help me jump into that first group and say, okay, I'm ready to get on board.
Suppose you had relatives in India that you wanted to send money to, or suppose you had medical information that had to move from one jurisdiction to another. The ways that we have now are terribly inefficient. They are exclusive of the marginalized society. So I think we have some very specific use cases that we're looking at, both from a technical perspective in terms of legal age, et cetera, as well as on the governance side.
Yeah.
And the contribution of use cases that you have in your experience would be immensely valuable to this discussion.
And we've segmented use cases into three kinds. People going to countries to visit. People dealing with countries remotely. So I'm sat at home, but I'm trying to open an account somewhere else, but I'm doing it remotely. And things that are nothing to do with countries whatsoever. And this is where the emerging metaverse will sit. The picture I had of the globe doesn't exist there. It can be virtual worlds of other planets out there. So we're again, get involved in what we're doing. We're building out those use cases and working out which ones we need to tackle first. And one of the things I'd like to do is to try and put an economic value on this problem, because it's an economic. If we can open up the ability to accept and move digital IDs around the world, the value of that to every, your McKinsey's give you, digital identity to an economy like the UK is 4 billion. That's a 4 or 5 year old McKinsey report. Of that 4 billion, what fraction of that is achieved through interoperability, through enabling new to country people to instantly access services? Is it 25% of that? Half of all bank account openings are for people who are new to country. So yeah, it may be as big as 25% of that as the economic value. So at some point, I'd like us to explore that as we're on this journey.
Okay, Steve, go ahead. We start where the industry is, which is to begin to think about what does the wallet have to do with this conversation? How do the upcoming European EU requirements for wallets influence the notion of gain and interoperability? So I think we're taking in, as we're taking in use cases, we're also taking in new developments in our ecosystem, which all of you are hearing in real time. We think that by recruiting national identity programs, by recruiting large international companies that have a stake in global interoperability, and recruiting the people in this room who have a stake in open standards, is the way to go. We want to prove that this can work from a technical point of view and a governance point of view. And guess what? That's hard work. That's a slog. I'll employ my favorite joke about identity, which is there's 3 things you don't want to watch getting made: sausage, legislation, and standards. It's a grueling kind of iterative process, but it's how you build the infrastructure that we think is reflective of the world today, which is an increasingly interconnected economy and society. So next steps: join, contribute, criticize, improve the work on the rules and tools side.
Yep. Cool.
Thank you all for your time and attention. Nick and I are available. We put some of the learn more places. We think as individuals and organizations, the POC will be a great testbed and educational environment. And on the governance side, the work that Nick is leading there is really state-of-the-art in terms of how do we construct these new multilateral contracts that allow us to engage in trusted transactions on a global basis, on a high volume and velocity, and increasingly a variety of use cases. So thanks again for your time.
And on Friday, 8:45.
Yes.
There is a panel so we're talking to you about what we're doing to move going forward. There will be a panel where people are going to come together to talk about why gain is important to them. And the panel is relying parties. It's people who want to accept identities. So do come along. I know it's early in the morning, but come along to that panel on the Friday if you wouldn't mind.
Friday, you'll have a chance to see who's doing it. And I think that's, as we all know, a key piece.
Yeah.
Good.
All right. We got a question there. Did you?
I think it's great work, and you guys aren't the first to think about this, right? So you've got the Trusted IT Foundation that's been working on governance frameworks for about 3 years. I understand you are talking to them, so that's good. But I think, there's lots of roads that got here, and I hope we can include all of it and not just frame it as like, oh, here it goes, ta-da.
One of our mantras is to build on what's built. That goes with standards, that goes with people and infrastructure. So we're not trying to invent anything. We're not building a product. We're creating a network of networks. And we think that's pretty powerful. So again, thank you for your,
You mentioned something about what you were talking about.
I'm sorry?
You mentioned you're working with Government of India for some project.
iSpirit and the Aadhaar folks. Yes, we think it's important that our Indian colleagues, who probably have the most sophisticated set of trust frameworks, the most well-integrated identity and financial services and government services ecosystem, be at the table and be a very prominent contributor to this work.
And they are part of that panel on Friday. I think Sid Chetty's flying in, I believe, for that panel. So, cool. I think
There,
I think we have to wrap up at that point.
We do.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you all.
we'll
Again,
take your
happy to
question
talk to you more.
offline, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.